Today's video is brought to you by URCD Keys, the best source for Windows 10 and Office Professional product keys at deeply discounted prices. More details at the end of the video.
SpaceX competitors join forces to oppose Starlink upgrade for improved polar coverage. No, you shall not do that. Although we did the math on this and we don't know exactly quite how it's going to work because you need like 33 million blinking whatever it is up in space.
The promises that Starlink have made are you know what, we're not even going to look at the rest of this article because it's not important. It's linked down below if any of you want to read it. It really is just a bunch of squabbling. Linus did a review of Starlink recently, and he got like 18,000 trillion billion views on it. See how many views he got. 2.2 million views. Well, freaking good for you, Linus. Love you, man. And if you listen to the comments, now, I know he's making an entertaining video, and it's not a critical analysis, and I get that. I don't know what his viewpoint really is on it, because he doesn't really cover it in the video. He just, it's his typical goofy video. Hi, Linus. Anyway, here's the thing. The promise is gigabit internet to 1 billion people. Elon Musk has stated, and the written mission goal of Starlink is to bring high-speed gigabit-like fiber connections to 1 billion people of the world who do not make any economic sense to run cables to. Certainly in major metropolitan cities, you can wire major metropolitan cities with fiber. That makes sense. But if you get outside of the major cities, if you get into rural areas, farmland, people on ships, people in the jungle, people in third world countries, they don't have the infrastructure to wire it. They're not likely to get it. And so what is somebody in Zimbabwe supposed to do if they want high-speed internet? Well, in theory, this will provide gigabit speeds up and down to everybody in the world who wants them. I had a look at the Starlink website, and they do post some numbers about what each satellite can do and the speeds, because they use the, I believe it's the Ka and V bands for data transmission. Radio is not like your SSD that can be upgraded. Radio is physics. Radio is the universe. Each radio wavelength, there's a variety of frequencies, and a pack of frequencies can contain a certain amount of data because it goes up and down a certain amount of times. This is radio waves. This is how the universe works. This isn't something that we're not going to invent better radio. Unless it's Star Trek, then we'll have subspace radio. But in our current knowledge of radio, there's radio.
There's radio.
As you go to low frequency radio waves, you gain the benefit of being able to penetrate through more materials. Ultra low frequency radio waves can go through ocean water. Submarines use it to communicate. But the bit rates are very, very low because the wavelengths are very long.
Correct.
And even if you could transmit data on the like 2 or 3 bits on the rising edge and 2 or 3 bits on the falling edge, you might only be transmitting between 30 and 60 characters, letters per second. It's enough for a teletype machine. It's enough for nuclear launch orders to ballistic missile submarines.
But not internet.
That's it. Oh, God. It's enough for... and that's about it. As you go higher frequency, those are blocked by everything.
Yeah.
The higher frequency, the radio wave, walls, ceilings, clouds, water, snow, blocks all of it. But with higher frequencies comes higher bandwidth because it goes up and down faster per second, and so you can put far more bits into each frequency.
Right.
It is possible to overlap the frequencies. For example, you can have 100 megahertz, 101, 102, 103. With very fine-tuned equipment, you might get 100.5 and 101.5 or 101.1 and 101.3. You might recognize those as FM radio frequencies because that's how your radio in your car works. Mm-hmm. But they can only get so close before they start interfering with each other.
Correct.
What are you looking at?
Nothing. I'm listening to you.
Oh, okay. I thought you were like looking at somebody's comment.
No.
So you can get more precise radio receivers that will allow you to put them really close to each other. And if you start, like for example, FM generally starts around 86 to 88.
88, yeah.
It does vary from country to country, but about 88 up to about 108. 107.9 being the highest on the dial.
Correct.
Within that, you can put a certain number of radio stations. Now, our car radios still use analog, and there is HD radio, but we still use analog, and they're not as finely tuned as digital communications. If we redesigned FM radio today using all digital transmitters and all modern equipment, you could put a lot more stations. Right. Or you could cut the bandwidth in half and free up radio frequency for something else.
True.
But it is worth noting that a 100 megahertz radio frequency in the FM band is used for audio in the United States and can't be used for anything else. And so there's only so many different frequency ranges available.
Correct.
And so there is a cap to the amount of data that can be transmitted. Now, it is true that using beamforming and using very tightly focused radio transmitters, this satellite can use the same frequencies as this satellite so long as they're far enough apart and aimed to a spot on the ground far enough apart, and so long as the transmitters are precise enough.
Yep.
And so long as the transmitter on the ground is precise enough not to interfere with anything else.
That's true.
So that's fair enough. But with a satellite hundreds of miles up that is moving, because they're not geostationary. Correct. That means your transmitter on the ground has to track it. It has to move.
That does.
And the satellite on the sky has to change its direction using phased array transmitters. They don't physically move. It uses electronics to physically point the beam.
Correct.
Each satellite can only handle so many beams and so many spots on the ground before its spots start to get in the way of another satellite's spots. And yes, space is big, but the number of places you can put these satellites so they don't hit anything or each other, and the number of places you can point these on the ground, because humans are not evenly spread around the planet,
correct,
are limited. It is true that if you are in the middle of the Australian outback, you will probably always get great internet connection from Starlink because you have no competition for the beams. There's nobody out there. The more populated or the closer to an area where there's, thousands of people instead of hundreds of people, you start running into issues where only so many satellites can point their beams to one spot without overlapping, and only so many people can be transmitting up without hitting multiple satellites. Because as you increase the number of satellites, your transmission back up has to be narrow as well. And we're talking about a relatively inexpensive transmitter that has to transmit hundreds of miles and not end up with a beam 100 miles wide by the time it gets to space.
Well, and there's that, yes.
Now, I will absolutely acknowledge that the technology that they have developed is in fact very cool. The fact that it works at all, very cool. It's what they should do. It's awesome. I'm glad it exists. But we did the math.
We did do the math.
Here's the short version. In order to provide gigabit speeds to 1 billion people, Elon Musk will need 33 million Starlink satellites. There is not room to put 33 million satellites into low Earth orbit, given how the orbits have to cross with each other. There's several inclinations that have to be covered to provide different paths. There's a few steps of altitudes they can be put at, but they have to be separated by a certain distance. You're going to end up with collisions and tons of orbital debris, which is already becoming a problem. And at some point, too many people are too close to each other, and the beams run into each other.
Correct.
I mean, if 1 billion people were evenly spaced across the surface of the Earth, and there was nothing else in space to care about besides his satellites, you probably could say, screw it, we'll do it. But those two things aren't true, so who cares? The truth of the matter is he can probably provide 10 megabits per second
10 megabits.
to a couple 100 million people.
Megabits?
10 meg to a couple 100 million people.
Well, I guess
reasonably well over the next 5 to 10 years is probably what he can really do.
I guess it's if people have zero. That's
Oh, if you're in the
better
Australian outback, 10 meg is amazing.
Yeah.
I don't knock that. But the promise and what the reality is do not match.
No, the numbers don't add. No.
Zemex in chat just said, isn't satellite internet radio? Yes. Congratulations, you get 2 gold stars. It's radio. It's all radio. I sound like the sort of guy who needs to explore amateur radio. I am casually familiar with amateur radio. Amateur radio, like ham radio, it is an interesting thing that, thanks to modern technology, has very little use outside of the hobby space or the remote space. If we were going to go camp in the Australian outback, amateur radio or ham radio would make sense as a means to communicate, but here's the problem. So is a satellite phone.
We had a satellite phone.
And
it was expensive, but
you know what? It works everywhere. And in an emergency, you're glad you have it.
Yeah.
And it gives you the ability to dial a phone number as opposed to just transmitting in the blind.
Mm-hmm.
Amateur radio is a perfect example of something that absolutely is a hobby to a lot of people, but could never be a hobby to the masses. There's not enough frequencies and there's not enough bandwidth.
Correct. Yeah.
You'd end up with too many people trying to talk.
You have to be registered.
Yes, you've got to have a license.
Yeah.
In most of it. There's some of it that isn't, but yes. URCD Keys is the best source for genuine Windows 10 and Office Professional product keys that work the first time, every time. Get 20% off normal prices using our discount code BST for Byte Size Tech and the link in the video description below. $15 gets you a Windows 10 Professional OEM key that is a real product key, activates directly with Microsoft, use it forever as it links to your Microsoft account and it works through reinstalls. Get a full copy of Office 2019 Professional Plus for about $50 that redeems at setup.office.com using your Microsoft account. It also works forever through reinstalls. We have been using URCD keys for almost 3 years now and recommend you do so as well.